Good morning and welcome to Words That Matter Modern Day Book Club. I'm your host, Lee Smith. I'm very excited about today's guest. She's written a brand new book. It's terrifically important. And we have her very early on to speak about her book because it's just out. And she's speaking about one of the topics that's really cuts to the core of what's going on in American society today. Everything from why aren't adults protecting younger people? Why is our medical profession irresponsible? Why are actual lunatics running the asylum and hurting people and hurting the country as a whole? The subject is the transgender agenda, transgender movement, I guess is probably a better way to put it. But we're going to talk to someone who's been looking at this for quite a while. And the title of her book is DeTrans, True Stories of Escaping the Gender Ideology Cult. Welcome, please, Mary Margaret Olohan. Mary Margaret, thank you so much for being with us here today on Words That Matter.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, again, congratulations on the book. It's really interesting because you're doing something very important. It's not a polemical argument. You're not just speaking with important medical professionals or people of a political position, but you're speaking to people who have gone through this, who have gone through what's happening. So, if you can explain first of all what got you interested in this subject, and then how you went about reporting it and writing it.
Well, yeah, so I've been interested in culture wars, gender ideology for a good bit now, and I've been reporting on these things for about 5 years as a reporter, whether at the Daily Signal, Daily Wire, Daily Caller, all the different places that I've worked. It's just been a passion of mine. And as I was reporting on the culture wars, I started noticing that this nebulous phrase, gender affirming care, kept popping up. And one of my editors a couple years ago we put our heads together and he said, why don't you do a story on gender affirming care and what it actually means? Because at the time, we didn't really know what it meant, but we kept seeing it used places and it was very, nebulous. And it was pretty clear it was a euphemism, but we weren't sure what it was for. And so I did a deep dive at the time, and our story showed that gender affirming care meant transgender surgeries, hormones, and puberty blockers, even when we're talking about kids. And I mean, at this point in the game, we know that, right? Like that's fairly common knowledge to those of us who are paying attention to gender ideology. But at the time, it was kind of wild because we knew that they were pushing these types of transition procedures for adults. We weren't totally sure that they were pushing them for young people. And so after I did that story, I really started zeroing in on instances where young people had been affected because I noticed that establishment media, such as the New York Times, loved to say that kids weren't being transitioned. They would pretend that that was an outlier, it was just an extreme case that Republicans were pushing, et cetera, et cetera. And so I started looking around for stories of detransitioners. And once I found one, then I started finding so many, especially people on social media. Because over the past 5 years or so, there's been this slowly but surely growing movement of people speaking out about regretting their transition procedures. And so a lot of these people were starting to speak up on Twitter, which is where I found many of them. And there was one night where I tuned into a Twitter Spaces event, and it was just a whole bunch of people who had tried to transition and were talking about their experiences. And I vividly remember this because I was making myself dinner and I was so fascinated that I was forgetting to eat. These people were telling me stories that they bordered on sci-fi, the way their bodies had been affected by hormones, their voices were changed. One person would speak and I would think it was a guy, and it turned out it was a girl whose voice had been permanently altered by testosterone. And the stories they were telling were so sad, but also so important and moving that I thought, I got to come back to this. So when I had an opportunity a couple years down the road to write a book, I said, I want to write it on detransition. That's what I want to do.
Let me ask, what percent of young people, let's say young people, what percent of people who go through this process at a later date say, you know, that was a mistake. I was in the middle of a social contagion, or I wasn't doing very well emotionally, psychologically. How many people are there who say, okay, this was a bad idea, I'm going to DeTrans? Do we have a good sense of that now?
We don't have a good sense of that, and one big reason is that a huge number of detransitioners don't tell their doctors that they're actually detransitioning. So Lisa Littman is a researcher who did an amazing study several years ago. That study found that only about 24% of detransitioners actually went back to their doctors and told them that they detransitioned. And that's wild because that's a very low number. But at the end of the day, when you think about what they have been through, these are people who, let's say, you know, a 16-year-old girl who has undergone an attempted gender transition. She's gone on testosterone for years and got a double mastectomy, and then realizes that this was a mistake, that she can't actually become another gender. Um, to go back to her doctor and tell the doctor that this was all a mistake is kind of akin to going back to an abuser that has hurt you very much and saying, hey, you abused me and I didn't like it, and I'm just letting you know that I'm done with you abusing me. Or, you know, I just want you to know that I didn't like how you abused me. It's a very similar situation where these doctors told these young people that they would be happier and that their mental health would improve and that they wouldn't commit suicide if they went through these procedures. And yet the young person is realizing that could not be further from the truth. They are not happier or better.
I'm surprised by the number that it's 24%, actually, because it seems fairly high. Because the way that I would understand that context is, no, if you go back and speak to the person who did this, that person has a stake in making and you not detransing. They don't have a stake in trying to help you now because they didn't try to help you at that point. So what do the people and your book is overwhelmingly about young people, right? So you're not speaking to the Rachel Levine types, the Caitlyn Jenner types, middle-aged men, often in late middle age, who go and decide that they're or believe that they're a woman. You're talking about young people, and I believe that you're talking mostly about young women who transition to men. Actually, let me ask: do girls and young women who transition to males, do they have more? Do they detrans more than young boys or young men who transition to females?
Well, the young women who transition or attempt to transition, because we know you can't actually become another gender, they do experience a whole range of side effects from the testosterone um, that are horrific and hard to recover from. And I will say the young men who try and transition as well experience a lot of side effects from the estrogen. So I wouldn't say that one experiences more than the other, they're just different. The girls, for example, when they begin taking testosterone, there's a little bit of a honeymoon period where they feel really good. And this is sometimes because they've been on puberty blockers before. So they just don't really have any hormones in their body. And so when they begin taking testosterone, there's just rush of hormones and they feel really good and energetic. And, you know, they assume that's because they're, you know, becoming a boy and they're feeling better. Uh, and then once the testosterone begins to kick in, they told me that their skin would become coarser, that they would lose hair in certain areas, like in hair on their head, and then they would grow hair in other areas that they weren't expecting. They said that their muscle density changed, their bone structure or their bone density changed, their fat distributed differently. You know, whereas women carry weight usually more in their hips, they might begin to carry it more in their stomach or in their legs. And they've experienced a lot of physical side effects like this, which would also come back to haunt them later, giving them really serious backaches or neck aches or just feeling like their shoulders were too heavy for them because the bones had changed. Uh, and then they also experience a lot of mental side effects. So, for example, Helena, one of the girls in my book, told me that she experienced such extreme rage that her father would have her go out and chop wood to try and get some of that pent up aggression out. They also told me they felt increased sexual urges like they had never felt before. One girl said she said it felt like probably what it felt like to be a young boy going through puberty. But then they also compared it to what it must have felt like to go through menopause in the mood swings and uh, the intense hormonal rushes that they would have. So all in all, they're just experiencing this whirlwind of hormones and emotions and anxieties and physical side effects. And usually, uh, these young people don't feel better from taking the testosterone, after that honeymoon period is over. And so they're looking for the next thing that will make them feel better. And what they're told is that surgery, the next step in their so-called gender journey, which is what the doctors and therapists call it.
I mean, my understanding is that taking the hormones is debilitating enough, right? Because if we're talking about people detransing, my understanding is that these hormones can often affect a permanent damage. Of course, the operations are really bad. Mastectomies, removal of genitalia and mutilation. Of course, is mutilation. But that even the hormones can cause permanent damage. Is that accurate?
It is accurate. We do know people who have suffered a loss of fertility from taking the hormones. One of the biggest scandals in this whole thing is that the hormones are experimental. So we don't fully know their impacts. We do know some of the devastating consequences they have had, but we don't fully know what else they could do. And as the recent expose of the WPATH file shows, the World Professional Transgender Health Association, uh, the doctors who were involved in this organization were aware that some of the testosterone supplements that they're being giving, some of the testosterone hormones they're giving to girls were causing tumors. They were also aware that the young patients couldn't fully informed consent to these procedures since they were struggling from severe mental health issues. And they were aware that some patients were losing their fertility when they were taking testosterone. And yet none of them talked about this. And to the world, what they're saying is gender affirming care is vital for the safety and well being of young people. And denying this care to them is crucial, is dangerous, and is going to hurt them. And that's the messaging that we hear from the Biden White House, from the Department of Health and Human Services. That's the messaging we hear from the Department of Education, from all major medical organizations which cite WPATH's expertise, even though WPATH is internally acknowledging that these types of things are experimental. And so that's the situation that we're in right now, which is incredibly scary and disturbing when these very experimental procedures are being touted as the life-saving force for so-called trans youth, when in reality, many of these young people, if they were just given an opportunity to grow and to relax and to work on their mental health, would very quickly desist. And they're not being given that opportunity. They're being rushed down the path to transition, and they and their families are suffering the consequences.
Mary Margaret, this is such an important story you're telling, that your book tells. DeTrans, True Stories of Escaping the Gender Ideology Cult. When we come back, we have to take a short break right now for people who are watching on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, please make sure and come back with us. Make the jump exclusively to Epoch TV. And Mary Margaret, I'd like to pick it up on what happened to the medical profession, what happened to the media, what happened to the Biden White House, that everyone came to agree on this concept that you're talking about, gender-affirming care, and the amount of damage it's created for young people, the way it's destroyed families, the way it's ruined entire communities, and people just came to agreement on this profound and extremely dangerous lie. So I want to know, when we come back, how did this come about? In the meantime, we're going to take a quick break. Make sure you make the jump with us and come on back for a great discussion with Mary Margaret Olohan. See you in less than a minute.
This problem of bureaucrats out of control certainly predates Donald Trump, but it did reach a new level with Donald Trump for a few reasons. One is that he was so unpopular with the career bureaucrats. 95% of all contributions from federal employees in 2016 go to the Democratic Party.
So now he's in a city where the bureaucracy overwhelmingly voted against him. So he has the bureaucrats against him, the news media against him.
You also see collusion between bureaucrats and the media moving up to a new level. Some of the country moving further to the left in terms of the intelligentsia. And I blame a lot of this on our colleges because they have taken over by radicals in the last 50 years. And so things that used to be just sort of the far left, academic loony left have now come to the mainstream.
Our great guest today is Mark Moyer. We're here to speak about, among other things, his new book. And the title of that new book is Masters of Corruption: How the Federal Bureaucracy Sabotaged the Trump Presidency. You may or may not be surprised to find out one of the sources of the great Mark Moyer's conservatism. So make sure you make the jump.